to everybody. Croeso and welcome to this, our first Welsh webinar. This event has been put together by the Women's Campaign Merched Cymru and the Welsh branch of the LGBA, Lesbian, Gay and Bisexual Alliance Cymru. I'm Sarah Tranban, co-founder of LGBA Cymru, and I'm chairing this morning. Before introducing our amazing speakers, I'm going to do a wee bit of housekeeping and give a brief context. We welcome questions in the Q&A, though we've disabled the chat function. The wonderful Ali will be sifting questions from me and the speakers, and she sits on the executive of Merched Cymru and is vice chair of Nordic Model Now, so is eminently well qualified. We will be picking up questions at specific points in the discussion rather than as we go along. Otherwise, I know there's so much to say, we'll never get to the morning. Also, please check that the name, title or organisation you're showing on the screen is one you're happy to be displaying in this environment. This is a public space and we are recording. We know that some activists have been happy to dox or otherwise insult anyone challenging the juggernaut of gender ideology. All are welcome here, and I expect we will all learn a lot today. If you're tweeting or commenting on social media, please use the hashtags #CanThePlan, Sex Not Gender, Dim Diolch, and of course, Women Won't Wished. This week has been Labour Party conference. That's especially relevant to us here in Wales, with the Labour government and the party holding half the seats in Senedd. We've heard some breathtaking science denial and allegations that have been levelled against those of us who question gender extremism. Dinosaurs has been the least of it. The good news is that the days of no debate are clearly over. Yet Wales has been shutting down gender critical voices, many of them from the ranks of progressive coalitions and the left. In August, the government published its so-called LGBTQ Action Plan. And I should say we don't know what the plus means, so don't ask us that in the Q&A. They based this plan on the recommendations of a so-called expert panel. We, LGB Alliance Cymru and Merched Cymru, repeatedly volunteered to be involved, and I know that other speakers this morning did as well, but we were all ignored. Just a week or so ago, an FOI, a Freedom of Information request, revealed that that panel came from volunteers drawn from organisations across Wales. There was no proper appointments process, no attempt to ensure transparency, and no gender heretics either. This has been a process designed, apparently by Stonewall, to shut out any commentary or any dissent. The action plan has 58 recommendations. It's very wide-ranging, from providing statutory national trans guidance for schools to creating a Wales-wide coordinator for Pride. Some of them are welcome, but many have a sting in the tail. For instance, who writes that guidance and what are their qualifications for preparing such a powerful document? The clue is at recommendation 9, to seek devolution of powers in relation to gender recognition. The objective of policy in Wales is self-identification, placing the ineffable, unprovable notion of gender identity above the biological materiality of sex. Self-ID by stealth is at the core of this plan. We know that self-ID has direct consequences for people in our schools, in our hospitals, prisons, refuges, social spaces, and more. The campaigners are riding roughshod over anyone who raises questions about the ideology or its practical implementation, and the Welsh Government is along for that ride. This plan is not fixable. Instead, we urge the government to withdraw it and start again, this time with integrity and with transparency. We, lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, women and men in Wales, do not consent, and we will not wish. It's in this context that we have a stellar lineup to talk to us today. We will hear about the risks self-ID is causing to our Celtic neighbours who are at different places on this journey. We will hear from campaigners and activists who've been silenced and cancelled. And we will hear from experts in the health impacts of this extremist approach, from a treatment and a survivor perspective. After a short tea break, we'll have a lively panel discussion and a Q&A session. I hope you will find this morning both informative and energising. We all need to stop this juggernaut, to stop this nonsense in its tracks. So our first speaker this morning is journalist and broadcaster Laoise, the indomitable leader of the Countess, Ireland's preeminent voice against the impact of self-ID. And she is going to sound our first warning. Welcome, Laoise.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Solidarity with our Celtic brothers and sisters. I'm here to offer some insight from the ground in Ireland. So first of all, I wanted to talk about how we got here. I'll talk about the macro, the micro. I think also it's important to remember that whilst we were and possibly still are in some people's minds the poster child of self-ID, this is not the case that a law is brought into place and then the activists have enough. What we're witnessing on the ground in Ireland is a further rolling out of this ideology across the public sector via a suite of various laws. Then I want to speak about how we identified the problem, how we addressed it, our work on the ground, and ultimately I'll sum up to say, looking back on a year of campaigning, what worked for us and what didn't work. So first of all, as you probably are all aware, self-ID was brought into Ireland in 2015. And like with other countries, as seems to be the case currently in Wales, certainly it's how it happened in Denmark and undoubtedly in Ireland, it was latched onto more popular, in our case, marriage equality legislation. So in people's minds, this was just a kind of an add-on to that very, very popular, and there was huge consensus for that, and we had a referendum, which was a landslide. So the first problem that we identified really was to fill the information gap, to offer really a public service and run a public information campaign. And in terms of how this has worked on the ground, so self-ID came in, and I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of people in Ireland weren't even aware that this was the case and what the law actually did. So we were very much on the back foot, and we had to try to scramble to help people to understand what it actually meant and how, and the existential threat to sex-based rights and to same-sex attracted people. And that has been our challenge over the past year. The Countess was won only 2 days ago. So I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of talk about how we campaigned and how we addressed this. As with Wales and with other countries, undoubtedly LGBT rights, the LGBT rights have been the Trojan horse. So you mentioned briefly in your introduction about how this ideology is rolled out across schools. So that's likewise in Ireland. One of our earlier kind of social media campaigns was to highlight the lack of safeguarding, in fact, the breaches of safeguarding in anti-LGBT bullying resources in schools in Ireland. So more recently in Ireland, so self-ID was brought in 2015, but then more recently, what we are dealing with on the ground is a whole suite of template bills, hate crime, conversion therapy, the amendment to our Gender Recognition Act to include children, because currently minors must go to court, but it's in the programme for government to amend that to allow children to change their gender legally. And the last one, which is coming up quite soon, is an amendment to all of our equality legislation to include gender identity as a ground. Now, some of you may be aware that that's how this has come into play under Biden with his executive order. It's a kind of pretty much the exact same device. So what it would mean is that in reality, were I in a communal changing room with my daughters and a man walks in, I'm prevented from defending that female space from him, as is the owner of the gym. And we are seeing this nightmare scenario playing out in California already. in terms of how this is bedded down in Ireland, there are currently sexual predators and violent men who identify as women currently in the female estate in Ireland. Now, it's important to note that at the moment there is a security protocol in place where they are actually confined to their cell for 23 hours a day. Now, with that in mind, we have submitted a 20-page document. We brought in expert help to work on this with us. And we submitted it to the prison review of prison rules consultation recently. We were very limited as to the scope, but we looked at the rules that we felt best address that problem, because this is an issue around whether a man who fills out a form can be treated as a woman for all purposes, which is the case in our law in Ireland at the moment. In terms of our campaigns on the ground, so we identified the problem as one of public awareness and public understanding, and we launched across all our different media platforms, social media platforms, and we started trying to get the message out. And I'm not going to lie, it was, it's been a slog. It is like pushing a boulder up a hill. But I would say a year in, we are on the flat, and it's still quite rocky, but it feels like the tide has turned in Ireland. There has been a huge shift in the discourse. We are now, only yesterday, there was an op-ed in one of the national newspapers where a woman completely spoke about not only her experience as a woman, in terms of living in this world in her sexed body, but she just talked about all the different points. It was probably the most robust piece of editorial I've ever seen in the country. Looking at the whole issue, it was the news hook was language. So in terms of our campaigns, the first campaign we ran was "We Will Be Heard," which was our response to the letter signed by the National Women's Council of Ireland and Amnesty, and that trended globally. And that probably got, I feel like our job has been to raise consciousness as well as public awareness, and then there's the kind of political work. So, it's about building blocks, because you can't do one without the other, really. And then the campaign we ran that broke the kind of mainstream media monolith, really, because we've been sending press releases for months and months and months. It was the campaign to preserve single-sex toilets in Irish schools. So this is a really egregious example of gender identity ideology just running away with itself. So you get to a point where, when you're so far down the kind of upside down, that you have civil servants in your country who believe it is a sensible thing to take out all single-sex toilets, take them away from schoolgirls, and even retrospectively. So the plan was that all retrofitting and all new builds would have no single-sex toilets. There have been ministers' questions on that, and there was a slight backtrack, but we are not going to let that one go. The other campaigns we've done are around the indoctrination of school children. So this is a huge concern, and parents are not happy about this at all. It happens in various different ways. So one I mentioned earlier was LGBT bullying resources. And that happens because there's a vacuum. So I'm really grateful to see LGBT Alliance setting up all over the world, and we hope they're going to regroup in Ireland, because I feel they're the authority in this area, that they can speak to the struggles that LGBT young people may have coming out, or LGBT people, young people may have coming out in a school environment. So at the moment, there's a vacuum being filled by, the so-called experts who will, in the resources, tell teachers to transition young people without their parents' knowledge, for instance. So that was one of our campaigns as well, against pledge packs, which were being sent out, and school children in different schools in Dublin were being asked to pledge to normalise pronouns, essentially a pledge of allegiance to one of the key kind of tenets of gender identity ideology. So we did some media on that, and it was taken up for the first time ever, which I thought was significant, taken up by the Red Tops, because I think it's really important to get your message out to all demographics. And then, of course, we ran a poll. Now, the poll was very important to us because you get a lot of flack when you do this work, and there is a backlash, and what the other side will say is that your position is fringe or somehow driven by hate, or you're aligned to the right. I mean, we all know this is all complete nonsense. But the poll is a very important data set, because it shows that it proves what you always knew to be true, which is that your position, to protect single-sex spaces, for instance, is what the vast majority of the public want and agree with, and your position is not fringe in any way. And with regard to self-ID as a mechanism, in fact, fewer than 1 in 5 people in Ireland, only 17% of a representative poll in Ireland agree with self-ID, agree that you can change your birth cert. And I spoke to one of the architects of self-ID in the summer, and he said, one of the things that we did wrong initially was to falsify public documents to assuage mental distress. And I think it's really important to roll back to that truth, really. Now, in terms of looking back on what worked and what didn't work, I would say that one of the key things I've learned is, as activists, all we have is our intellectual assets and our solidarity. And so it's really important to identify what will have the most impact. We're a group of women, most of us are mothers, we're juggling small children, some people have children with disability, jobs, households. So I've tried to identify what has the highest yield and what has the greatest impact. So consultations are really important, and obviously that's why you're mobilizing and galvanizing. And I would say as well, what I've realized is mainstream media, even though arguably mainstream media, terrestrial television and news is not where people get their news anymore. And people, obviously, the home crowd, the gender critical crowd will tune into all your offerings. But I have seen a huge shift on the ground here once we became, a credible source in the mainstream media. And I think you can, once you achieve that, there's a huge ripple effect. So I'm happy to say that it's in no small part to a constant drip of articles in the mainstream media here. I think 12 in total in the last 12 months, but it's probably in the last 6 months of those 12 months of campaigning. Because like so much in life, it looks like it happened overnight, but it's been a really hard slog on the ground. But I think it's that's one of the reasons that we are now finding allyship politically. So I'm very pleased to say I had a 2-hour meeting with a public representative yesterday, and I think that could be very, very significant, very pivotal for us, because for a long time it was like we were knocking our heads against the wall and not getting any response, and just being kind of either ignored, which is, it's horrible. It's difficult to do really good work and just get tumbleweed. But I think in retrospect, it's important to know you're being watched, and there's a huge swathe of people who agree with you but are afraid. And some of them are afraid to say the wrong thing. They don't want to be seen to be transphobic or homophobic, and they're terrified of the backlash. And some are just really unsure, they're just unsure. And a word of warning, I suppose, as well, is that I would say that there is also, which has been a bit of a shock to some of us, there is a swathe of people who are completely, who have taken this on like a religious belief. And I think it's important to keep all those different people in mind all the time with your messaging. So I wanted to add and kind of end on a positive note. In just 1 year of campaigning, we have achieved a huge shift, and from the back foot and from thin air, literally, I feel like women have been mobilized and politicized and radicalized and they've never done anything like this in their whole lives. And it's because they grasp the existential threat to their rights and to their daughters' rights. So yes, I just hope that you can take heart from our work and what we have achieved. I feel like this huge, big juggernaut that was about to go over the top of the cliff. I mean, I know we have self-ID since 2015, but it can get worse than that, actually, because at least there may be no state intervention built into self-ID, and there certainly isn't when a man who raped his son for 2 years can get a gender recognition certificate, when a man who fractured someone's skull can get one, when a homicidal teenager whose own mother is on the run, who's who tore the eyelid off his social worker. When these men can acquire gender recognition certificates, of course, there is no actual safeguarding to speak of, but at least there's a form one has to fill out. Whereas my huge concern is if our equality legislation is amended to include gender identity as a ground, that will trump any sex-based rights. And I think that's the next dystopian level for us. But I do feel that there is awareness in Ireland now of disquiet, and that's the first step. And I think politicians then must take notice, and they're kind of put on notice.
Thank you so much, Diolch. Very both sobering reflections, but also reasons for hope. And I think you're right that point at which the media start not only seeing, but talking about what the risks and issues are here is a really important turning point. And I think that we've seen that to some extent in the UK just this week. We've still got a long way to go, especially in Wales. And I thought your comment that don't falsify public documents to alleviate mental distress, I think is a really important truth in that. Following on from events in Ireland, many of us have also been following events in Scotland and in all of our sisters' fierce activism over there. And very few come more fierce than Rhona Hotchkiss. She spent years as a prison governor, and she knows a great deal about the impact of transgenderism on some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And she's also faced more attacks than most for her outspoken defence of those very same vulnerable people. So I'm going to hand over now to Rhona. Welcome.
I'll unmute myself now and say that again. That was Bore da Cymru agus Madanva a Alba. Thank you very much for that overblown introduction, but I'll take it. What I wanted to talk about this morning was 6 or 7 points around what's been happening in Scotland. I suppose as a sort of warning for Wales and I think other countries, because Scotland has rushed headlong into this. The last two and a half years has seen for me an unprecedented raft of legislation aimed at this one area, and it's quite stunning. So I'm going to take you through some of the stuff that we've been fighting against in Scotland, and that is a huge issue of concern for us. In addition to the GRA, which was the reason I started speaking out, and you're quite right, for me it was about the impact on women in prison. We had a hate crimes bill introduced last year that wanted to criminalise hatred without ever defining what constituted hatred against men claiming to be women, but not against crimes against women. So under this bill, if someone shouts abuse at a man in the street for trying to look like a woman, they can be prosecuted for phobic hate crime. If someone shouts abuse at a woman in the street just for being a woman, that's okay. And the Scottish government thought that was okay. They said they couldn't include misogyny because it's too complicated. That was their reason for not including it in the hate crimes bill. Instead, they have set up a commission under someone who believes that trans women are women. So what we expect from that is that trans women will be doubly protected. Once this commission comes out, I'm quite convinced that they will say that trans women are women, so any crime against them is misogyny, but they are also trans, so transphobic hate crime against them will also be a crime. It's ludicrous. The same bill, which was not surprisingly compared to something from Stalin's Russia, would have seen people prosecuted for conversations in their own home with friends round the dinner table. If anyone said things the government didn't like and someone at that dinner in that person's home didn't like. Actors could potentially have been prosecuted for saying things on stage that people considered hatred, even if such things were said as part of a drama. Theatre owners, producers, directors and so on could have been prosecuted for what other people considered to be some kind of phobic hate crime. We then had the debacle of the Forensic Medical Services Bill, where the Justice Minister Now, I'll sound as though I'm attacking the governing party who just happen to be the SNP, but that's only because they are the governing party. The other parties aren't any better. In fact, I would say the Green Party is worse and Labour's not far behind. There is some opposition, and it pains me to say this, but the party standing up for free speech is the Tory party, and we of course have a much smaller party called ALBA, which is pro-independence, and they are completely on side with the fight against this. So the Forensic Medical Services Bill, our Justice Minister tried to push through a clause saying that a victim of sexual assault, I do apologise, it was the Health Minister, could choose the gender of their medical examiner. And then the government resisted when a fantastic female MSP called Laoise insisted that women or anyone who's been sexually assaulted should be able to choose the sex of their examiner. The government and its supporters insisted that gender and sex were interchangeable terms, but the howls of protest that rained down on the heads of those insisting sex was the term that should be used suggested otherwise. So it was clearly another backdoor attempt to move us away from an understanding of sex towards gender being the all-encompassing term, because of course gender has come to be recognised as including trans women. Thankfully, Johann Lamont's amendment won the day, and we now have a bill that says sex instead of gender, so that was a real win. But the issue did lead to the very high-profile resignation of one Green MSP who said he was ordered to vote against it. So the Greens were whipped to order to vote against an amendment that would allow people to choose the sex of their examiner. The real issue for me in Scotland, and I think this will be becoming true in other places, is not so much in England at the moment, but possibly in Wales, that our government has created an echo chamber on issues of sex and gender, whereby the only opinion they value, and sometimes the only opinion they listen to, are those from groups they directly fund. No wonder so many of them claim in government that there is no clash of rights in the sex and gender debate, because they're not hearing it. And I suspect it's because they know that it would challenge what they're saying. The charity and other groups funding application process in Scotland that requires applicants to say how they will be trans inclusive, but it never, not once, anywhere in the application process asks them how they will apply the single sex exemptions allowable under the Equality Act. We've also heard this week about a gagging clause that has been built into the funding agreements of some charities, whereby the money is contingent on them not criticising the government. Now, the government say it's about them not being political at all, but of course it includes not criticising the government. So if you're any kind of LGB group looking for funding to support our view of things, you're not going to get it in Scotland. The government just won't give you it. The Scottish government's LGBT blah, blah, whatever else it is, I can't even remember how many letters are attached to the end, guidance to schools was issued in the last couple of weeks. Now, this relies heavily on a document which was written by one of their pet trans rights activist groups, one of the groups they fund, of course. And the document uses pseudoscience throughout, like the term gender assigned at birth or sex assigned at birth. They treat that as though it is science instead of contested nonsense. This guidance tells teachers they should allow any child from the age of 4.5 to determine and state their own gender and select their pronouns, which teachers should then use, and parents don't have to be informed. In fact, it's gone further than that in some schools, and teachers are being encouraged to actively deceive parents. So they should use a child's chosen pronouns, a child of 4.5 or 5, use their chosen pronouns, but remember to revert to the correct ones that the parents will recognise if you're talking to the parents. Of course, there's nothing dangerous there in encouraging young children to hide things from their parents but share them with other adults. Nothing could possibly go wrong, could it? Parents were neither consulted nor informed about this guidance. Now, the Scottish Government defends it by saying, well, it's guidance, it's not mandatory. But of course, teachers, like healthcare staff, like prison staff, like everyone else, are afraid for their jobs. They're afraid for their career progression. They see their colleagues in academia and other places being sacked, being cancelled, being abused, having threats against them. No wonder teachers don't want to put their heads above the parapet here. The majority of them don't agree with this. And in fact, one teaching union has been brave enough to ask for this guidance to be withdrawn because of child safeguarding. But of course, Scottish Government didn't see anything wrong with it, and neither did the civil servants that wrote it for them. We have a trans-identifying chief executive of a very large rape crisis organisation in Scotland, who has said that if women present for counselling and support following sexual assault, if they insist on being seen by an actual woman, as opposed to a man identifying as a woman, these women should expect to have their transphobia challenged, and that Rape Crisis, will help these women to reframe their trauma so that they stop talking about it being men raping women. This, of course, is done by an organisation that receives public funding. And of course, in their application, none of this will matter. They will be given the funding because nobody in government thinks there's anything wrong with this. We have party leaders who do nothing about assault, rape and death threats against countless party members, including some of their own representatives, but rush to put out personal videos when a few dozen trans activists threaten to resign, assuring them that they're welcome in their party. We have MSPs and MPs who get away with throwing the term hate group at any organisation that doesn't bow to the assertions and demands of trans rights activists without ever, and Leisha referred to this as well, without ever having to provide a shred of evidence that these groups are hate groups. This is, of course, aligned with assertions that these same groups are sinister, shadowy, and of course funded by right-wing individuals, usually from the United States and usually Christian. We have now MPs and MSPs who are refusing to meet or even correspond with their own constituents. We've had them saying, do not contact me again on this matter, about anyone raising concerns about any of the things that we've talked about. At the same time, these same politicians are claiming that nobody cares about these things, no one's raising it on the doorstep, and that it's a side issue by a few demented women. A group of politicians our group of politicians are so far gone in Scotland that they can hold a trans day of remembrance in Parliament without being able to name a single trans person who has ever been murdered in Scotland for being trans. Now that is something we should be celebrating, but we need to start getting our representatives to question this stuff that they just do without even thinking about it. We have prominent people claiming that ribbons in the suffragette colours are threatening. It's now known as hateful haberdashery. Someone's actually planning to open a shop called Hateful Haberdashery. And that somehow trans people are not safe walking the streets if there are women around wearing suffragette colours or talking about women's rights. We have lots of evidence for Women Scotland and LGBT Alliance that academics, politicians, medical staff and even lawyers know this is all nonsense, but they're too afraid for their jobs, their livelihoods, their career progression, their reputation, their mental health, so they just shut up. What chance do our young people have of resisting this when they're lacking role models speaking out? What hope for the young people who want to stand against this but find themselves isolated and afraid? Where is the politicians' concern for them? We're never done hearing politicians concerned about gender dysphoric young people, and so they should be. So they should be. And I'm someone who argues for a better, faster, more comprehensive mental health response to confused young people. But we need to hear them starting to speak out for all the young people who are being silenced and taught that freedom of speech is nothing to be valued. And yet, what I want to say most of all in all of that is, what this has done is galvanised women in Scotland like never before in my lifetime, and I'm 60 and I've campaigned on lots of feminist and women's and LGBT issues. The sense of solidarity we are getting from being together, 400 of us outside the Scottish Parliament. Oh, by the way, following that, the government are now trying to introduce legislation that will not allow people to gather outside of the Parliament. so that they can be heard by those in the chamber. It's absolutely shameful. But the amount of courage and determination being shown across Scottish society is now remarkable. We still need more young people. And what I would say to Wales is get as many and as varied a group of people as possible. We need middle class, working class, unemployed people, people from all kinds of backgrounds speaking out and standing together. A really, really encouraging thing that happened this week was that our outgoing chief scientist, who's a woman, said in an interview, of course you can't change sex, and legislation that says you can is based on ideology and not science. So are they going to dismiss her as hateful? Are they going to dismiss her as uninformed? Our numbers are growing in Scotland. The kickback is growing, I believe, and the key to making that universal or near universal is to get ordinary people involved. So many ordinary people still don't know this is happening, and that would be my message to Wales. Get out there, get into the shopping centres, all of the places that ordinary people go, outside football games, get people on your side, because they will be.
Thank you, Rhona. Absolutely the rousing finish that I knew you'd be saying. And I think there's so many frightening things in what you say. And the issue of safeguarding in particular is one that I think many of us find extraordinary. The number of politicians, leaders, bureaucrats, civil servants, all sorts of people just ignoring every red flag that we've learned over the last 30, 40 years. And this point about, don't criticise your government, we will refuse a venue for this very event on the basis that we might be conceivably criticising the government, and that might give them some problems with their funding. And so that's a very real issue in the silencing that we see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of the good questions that are coming up in the chat. And I think that the first one, which picks up on something that Leisha said, but I think is also exactly what Rhona's just been talking about. We know that there are lots and lots of individuals and small groups out there all across our countries who need to try and contact each other and meet up and talk about this matter and showing the people in our lives the dangers involved. And I think that's quite difficult to do. We keep trying to do it, and we keep working on that. But I'd be interested to hear from Rhona and Leisha any thoughts on how we can build that grassroots connectivity that makes such a difference.
I'll come in first, if that's okay. So two things. First of all, for Women Scotland and LGBT Alliance work really, really closely together. And we have taken out several newspaper ads which have done a lot, full page ads in broadsheets and so on, which have done a lot to raise awareness. And we're also working really hard to get women's groups working together. So we're forever looking to make links between groups and individuals and so on in different parts of the country. And I think organisations, groups like Soul Sisters, who did the wonderful shoe protests around the country, have done really well in bringing isolated individuals together. So I think it's just about looking for opportunities to link people, people that contact, because lots and lots and lots of women contact for Women Scotland, linking them with other people in their area, encouraging them to start groups, supporting those groups as they begin to get together. And for people who are willing to speak out, like yourself, Sarah, like me, like Leisha, been willing to go and support these groups, to speak at their meetings, even if you're saying the same thing over and over and over again, because the majority of people still haven't heard the message. So it really is, it's about networking in a really big and a really small way. So think about big media, big events, and think about individuals, take names at the events, get people to link with them, get people to reach out to each other. Because of that, we've seen a huge proliferation in the number of dozens and dozens and dozens of women's groups around Scotland starting to work on this.
I think that's a really good point, and I've just realised that Leisha had to go, so thanks and goodbye to her. But we're certainly finding that, and our first event a couple of weeks ago, which our next speaker spoke at brilliantly as well, was testament to that. And suddenly we're finding, there are groups that I thought I knew quite a lot about what's going on, and suddenly I'm discovering all sorts of new and amazing people out there who are going, what can I do about this? How do I deal with this? And one of the things we're trying to put together at the moment is some, you know, if you want to go out and stand in your town centre, that's fantastic. Here's some thoughts on how you might do that and what things you might need to cover. But certainly take this opportunity to say to anybody out there, get in touch. And as you say, get out there and start talking to people.